Daryl. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you.
Daryl, I got a hold of you on Twitter. I've
hmm
seen your tweets. I've been a big fan of you, and you have a very interesting life. You've had a very many lived experiences. So first of all, let's start with what you're doing right now, and then we'll get into a little bit more of your biography.
Yeah,
You are currently a nursing PhD student. Is that correct?
that is correct. University of Missouri.
University of Missouri. So, nursing. Why nursing?
Um, I had applied to several traditional public health programs, and the one that I really wanted to attend at Loma Linda, great program, but they didn't offer any sort of fellowships, scholarships, or anything like that. So I would have been looking at 99,000 in student loans. And so I said, that's totally a no-go for me. So started doing some more searching around and found out about the University of Missouri. And their nursing program is very different than some of the other programs that I may have looked at. Um, they're very interdisciplinary, meaning that they create space for people who don't have that nursing background. So my background is pharmacology and public health. They're really training people to be healthcare researchers in whatever area that you want to go into. So none of my coursework has actually been nursing related, if that makes sense. Everything that I've taken has been statistics and research methods and public health theory and things like that. But the main thing about the program is it's being funded. So I pay maybe $500 out of pocket each semester. I get a tuition waiver for 9 to 12 credits, and then a little bit of money for a stipend.
Okay, wait a minute. So it's being funded by who or by
Well,
what?
we've got several different funding mechanisms. So my particular fellowship, the Sinclair Fellowship, comes from a family who donated this money to the school. They set this, I guess, they set this fund up for students like myself who need the funding. But we also have students who are receiving NIH money, like the T32 Fellowship, and I think at one point in time we had students who were on the McNair Fellowship. So there's just different streams that the school has to fund students.
Okay, that's really cool. And you
Yeah.
mentioned, I mean, I see this a lot on your Twitter feed, is that I see the term non traditional student.
Mhm.
Can you explain to us a little bit what exactly does that mean?
It means I'm an old man. I'm I'm actually 48 years old. As you said, I haven't had a traditional path to get to this point. I actually graduated from high school in 1989 and started college at Texas Southern University. But my parents were going through a pretty rough divorce. Plus, I was 17 years old. Didn't have any clue about what I really wanted to do with my life. My dad wanted me to go to pharmacy school. I ended up meeting a girl who was 24 at the time, so you can imagine how that ended up going. I essentially failed out of class, even got an F in weightlifting of all things, and so uh, yeah, I'm so the rest of the world's going to hear about that. But anyway, my dad was like, you need to grow up, you need to be a man, so you can't come home. You can sleep under a bridge, get an apartment, try to get yourself back into school, whatever you got to do, but you can't come home. So, I bumped around for a little while, tried the apartment thing, tried looking for little jobs, couldn't make that work. So I ended up enlisting in the Army. And when I was in the Army, I had the chance to deliver a baby during my combat medic training. And from that point on, I was sold on doing something in healthcare or public health. I didn't necessarily know which at that time, but it was a really formative experience for my life. I also developed a lot of confidence in my academic abilities, just a lot of confidence, period. Basically, I grew up in the Army. And so when I was released from active duty, came back into the civilian world, I worked a series of jobs, certified nursing assistant, EMT paramedic, pharmacy tech, just some things to sort of help me figure out what it was that I wanted to do with my life. And finally, in 2005, I decided to return to school for my undergrad studies.
That's amazing. It's interesting, right? Because like you said, you were essentially confronted with a dilemma. You were essentially almost homeless in a way, right? I mean, you
Right.
had to figure things out for yourself. What exactly made you decide to join the military?
There wasn't much more that I could do. I mean, I was working a job at Fiesta grocery store. Now, again, just to tell you how many years ago this was, minimum wage was like $4.25 an hour or something like that. So, working full time, I was literally bringing home, maybe 80 or 90 bucks a week, and it wasn't enough to live on. And so when I enlisted in the military, I didn't even at that time, I wasn't even thinking about combat medicine, or that was the job that I eventually did. But I wasn't thinking anything about that. I was just like, I need to get someplace stable so I can have food and some shelter and some clothing. And so I spoke with a Navy recruiter. I did so well on the ASVAB exam that they wanted to send me to nuclear propulsion school. But the idea of being on submarines really frightened me. So I went and spoke with an Air Force recruiter, and they said, "Well, you don't meet the weight cutoff." So finally, I saw an Army recruiter, and he's like, "Well, we have positions in combat medicine or culinary." And I said, "Well, I don't want to be a cook. Combat medicine sounds kind of cool, so I'll do that." And that's how that worked out.
Wow. I've actually never spoken with a US Army vet, so this is kind of really fascinating for me because it's a world I'm completely not familiar with. How long were you in the military?
Almost 20 years.
20 years, and you were a
Yeah.
combat vet the whole sorry, a combat medic, the whole
Combat
time?
medic. Yep. So I started off in the Army, and then when I was discharged from active duty, enlisted in the reserves, discharged from the reserves, and enlisted in the Air Force National Guard. And that entire time, I was a medic.
Wow. Did you serve overseas? Did you do any active duty?
The first Gulf War, yes.
Oh, you did?
Yep.
Okay.
Hmm.
Wow. Do you wanna talk
Hmm.
about that, or is that off limits?
Oh no, I mean, it was mainly for what I did. It was a lot of sitting around in the dirt, waiting for something to happen. Um, and of course, I was still a young man at that time, so I mean, it was scary. I have relatives who have served in the military, who have served in combat. A lot of friends, obviously, a lot of my commanding officers and things like that who had served in combat. Anybody who tells you that they're not afraid, when they're in that sort of situation, is lying to you. So it was a very scary time, but the war didn't go the way that people projected. As I recall, people were projecting, really, really high casualties. They projected that the Iraqi army was going to put up, one hell of a fight, and I think it ended up being a little over 100 hours or something like that.
Okay.
Um, we saw a lot of bombed out Iraqi positions, and so some of those images, some of those smells and things like that will stick with me forever. But luckily, things didn't go the way that we had anticipated.
Okay. There's a book by, Sebastian Junger called, Tribe. It's a
Hmm.
it's a book about have you read it?
No, I haven't heard of that.
Okay, yeah, it's about how troops form essentially a bond, right?
Hmm.
And it's interesting because I speak to a few people on this podcast who work in the arts, and they form a
Hmm.
bond with their film crew, or they form a bond with their artistic dance crew, whatever, and then
Hmm.
they leave. They're away, and then they're together, and they're super close, and then they come back home, and they have to go their separate ways. I'm just curious, since we're on this topic, did you have a very close bond with your troops?
Oh, absolutely. There are, some of the names I don't remember, but most of the names I do. Um, One guy in particular, his name was Robert McMullins. We went through basic training together, and unfortunately, we had to go our separate ways after basic training. But we stayed in touch for a number of years after that, and it was interesting. Our relationship was interesting, especially in light of sort of the things that are happening in America now with a lot of the racial unrest and things like that. Robert was from Alabama, um, me from Texas. We both grew up at a time where uh, pretty much it was either black people or white people, right? For example, the town that I grew up in, I was one of what? Gosh, there were maybe 6 or 7 African Americans in my high school, 1,500 white kids, and that was like my whole conception of race. It was a pretty conservative town, pretty conservative part of Texas. There were definitely some issues of race that occurred in high school, and so that really sort of shaped my view of the world and shaped my view of white people going into the military. And Robert's experience was more or less the same coming out of Alabama. And so we got to basic training. We didn't really like each other. And again, I don't think that either of us could have really put a finger on why we didn't like each other. It was just sort of this thing that was shaped by where we grew up at. And I remember our drill sergeant, saying, yeah, I think this was maybe third week of basic training. We had just both been screwing up, horribly. And he said, well, the way it's going to work from here on out, if one of you gets in trouble for anything, you're both in trouble and you're both going to get punished for that. And so he sort of, I guess, forced us into this marriage where we had to learn to work together to get our task completed. But what really grew out of that was a friendship. So I remember one night coming into our squad bay, and Robert was sitting on his bed crying, and my first thought is, what is this big old MF doing, crying? He was a big guy like me, and so, but at that moment, something else occurred to me. I said, well, maybe something's happened. Be a human. And go sit down next to him and ask him what happened. And so, what had happened, he had gotten a letter from his girlfriend, one of the so-called Dear John letters, saying she broke up with him, whatever.
Mhm.
And he just laid his head on my shoulder and cried. And I'm just sitting there. I put my arm around him. And so you imagine these two guys, well over 6 feet tall, 250 pounds, holding each other. But from that, our friendship blossomed. And and now that I think about it, it was just, I don't know, it was just stupid that, we had all of these original ideas of each other that were based on race and false assumptions and all of this other foolishness.
Yeah, this is what's interesting about being in close contact with people that you don't necessarily choose to be in close contact with, whether
Hmm.
it's in the
Hmm.
military or in the arts or whatever.
Right,
Um,
right.
so so then you leave the military, and I want to talk about your dad a little bit here, just because he
Hmm.
he was he a pharmacist? Is that what he did for a
Yeah,
living?
yeah.
So
My dad is a pharmacist.
he wanted you to be a copy of him in a way.
Well, I don't know that it was so much that he wanted me to be a copy of him as it was what he knew. And I mean,
Okay.
pharmacy. My dad was one of the few people in our town that was able to continue making a living when the recessions and all of the economic downturn of the 80s hit. Not only was he able to make a living, he was able to provide a very good living for the family.
Mhm.
Pharmacy is a excellent profession. It's just that I wasn't interested in it, but Dad just sort of felt like, look, I know that if you go into pharmacy, you'll always be able to have a job. You'll always be able to be paid well, stable career. So this is why you should do pharmacy. I think that for my dad's generation, um, you know, not a lot of African Americans went to college in the first place. So my dad was very blessed and very fortunate in that. But because of that, he wasn't exposed to the same how would I say this? The same sorts of things that I was exposed to, in high school and after high school and things like that. And I would say that if dad had had greater exposure, it's very likely that he would have, taken a different stance on what I should major in.
Right. So what kinds of things were you exposed to that inspired you, or what exactly are you talking about specifically in this experience?
Well, so when I was in high school, there was one teacher I had. His name was John Becker. Bless his heart. I don't know if he's still alive or not. He was in his 40s then, but he was an awesome, awesome, awesome biology teacher, and he was an awesome mentor. He was the only high school teacher that I had who took me under his wing to, mentor me and expose me to biology. I mean, that's where my whole life or my whole love of biology came up at. He had this little raggedy microscope set up in our classroom, and he would get pond water, and we would look at all these little things, these really cool little things scooting about, in the petri dish. And I was just uber fascinated by that. But my dad was like, how are you going to make a living looking at things under a microscope in a petri dish? And again, I don't think that he had this concept of how broad of a field the sciences really are. His exposure to the sciences was really very sort of limited to pharmacy. Pharmacology, pharmacognosy, pharmacoepidemics, and all these different sort of things here. Um, and so again, if he had maybe gone to a high school where he had had a teacher to take that sort of interest in him and to expose him to different worlds of biology or literature or arts or what have you, maybe he would have chosen something different, school, and maybe he would have wanted me to choose something different.
Right. Is your dad still, alive
Oh
today?
yeah, my
Yeah.
my old man, he is still alive and kicking, still working as a pharmacist. So dad is 73, and I don't think that he's ever going to slow down.
Has he changed his mind on you, or is he quite impressed?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that dad is a living example of how we evolve as people, right? So I can remember back in, I guess it was 96 through 97, I had moved back home to Houston, and I was living in a part of Houston, Montrose, and the Montrose area. It's really lively area, lively part of town. It tends to be the area that people associate with the LGBT community in Houston, right? And so my dad was extremely uncomfortable to come and visit in that area because, again, he had all of these stereotypes about the LGBT community. And so I remember in '97, my birthday that year, he pulled up in front of my apartment, and I'm like, "Oh, Pop, you can come on into come on in." He was like, "No, I'm feeling uncomfortable. Here's your gift." So he leans out the out the window of the car, it gives me the gift, and burns off. And now, my dad says, "I don't understand why I thought those sort of things. You know, why if these are just people like I'm a person, right?" And so, he's evolved in a lot of ways, in a lot of areas. He definitely isn't as conservative as he was when I was growing up.
Yeah, that's definitely a generational thing. I mean, I came out
Right.
when I was 18.
Right.
You know, and it was a totally different time when I was 18. I'm 43 now, so
Hmm.
we're kind of in the same age range.
Right. Right.
And I grew up in a rural community. So definitely, and my parents have come around, so it
Right.
takes time sometimes. It takes
Yeah.
exposure. Exposure is really important, right?
Well, exactly. Like my wife, her father, was a gay black male. Unfortunately, he's passed away. But I think through hearing the stories of love that my wife had for her father, or has for her father, um, I think that has helped to open my dad's eyes and helps him to understand that people are just people. Shit, I'm just gonna say it like that. People are just people.
Yep.
Period.
For sure. Can we is it okay to actually talk a little bit about your wife's dad for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely.
He was a gay black male in
Right.
Texas?
No, actually Detroit. So
In
my wife is
Detroit.
from yeah, my wife is from Detroit. So my wife and I, we actually met on the internet on this dating website back in 2006, and I had the chance to meet her father. I really wish that I would have been able to know him longer than I did. Unfortunately, he passed away in November of that year, right around Thanksgiving. Um, Derek Anderson was his name. He was a notable HIV/AIDS activist in the Detroit area, and I think maybe to say he was HIV/AIDS activist is probably limiting. He was just really into human rights, period, in all ways, and he was just such a really really good man. I think unfortunately, what ended up killing him was ignorance and stigma. So he suffered a small tear in his aorta, and when he got to the hospital, I guess that was the night of the 24th of November. Um, the hospital was so concerned about the fact that he was HIV positive that they spent the next 6 or 7 hours trying to transfer him to different facilities in the Detroit area. And when nobody could take him, they finally decided to do surgery, but it was too late. He, already lost so much blood, and so my wife had to make the decision to stop all treatment on him.
Oh man, that just
That
breaks
was
my heart.
that was tough, but and that's sort of one of the reasons why I want to go into medicine as well, because unfortunately you see a lot of stigma and a lot of stereotypes in terms of the way that we treat the LGBT population and women of color. And I mean, in fact, now that we're trying to have a child, one of the things that my wife says to me almost on a weekly basis is, Daryl, I'm scared to have a child because so many black women don't come out of L&D. They die. And a lot of it again is based on stereotypes, doctors who maybe not they don't listen to their patients, or they have preconceived notions or preconceived ideas about their patients. I mean, one of the things that my wife and I have both noticed is that when we see a doctor now, my wife, will tell the doctors, well, look, I'm a professor of medicine and public health at a local medical school, or I tell them I'm a PhD student planning to go to medical school, and they automatically treat us differently, but it shouldn't be that way.
Mhm.
You know, if I was a bum off the street going to see my doctor, he should treat me with the same respect that he would treat a PhD student or a professor of medicine. He should
Right.
listen to me and give me that same level of care that anybody else would get.
Are there any, like, numbers? Like, is this a very common thing? Like, so can you, like, give me more of a scope of what the problem is, or what, because you said, like, your wife is scared of delivering in a hospital. I mean, I have, I'm Canadian. I have very little experience with what it's like especially in the southern US. So
Mhm.
can you give me more of an example of, like, what is it exactly that's the problem? How common is it? Give me a bit more of a rundown on that.
I haven't seen any of the most recent numbers, and there's a lot of literature about this that's available though. But it's what I will tell you from coursework and my readings. African American women have some of the poorest birth outcomes in the United States. There's a lot of reasons for that. Not all of them are related to structural or systemic racial issues. A lot of them are, though. But I think that there's just a lot of factors that have come together, such as poverty, lack of education, lack of access to medical care. So, for example, here in the southern U.S., a lot of the southern states chose not to expand Medicaid, Medicare during the ACA era. So, a lot of people don't have access to adequate medical care. A lot of people don't know that they need to, go in to see the doctor at regular intervals or different sorts of things like that. When we talk about some of the stigma and stereotypes that doctors will sometimes hold against patients, there was a paper out of the University of Virginia a couple of years ago that talked about how a lot of medical students have this idea that African Americans don't feel pain the same way as white Americans, meaning we don't need as much pain relief because somehow our skin is thicker or we don't have as many nerve endings. I really don't know where those sort of beliefs come from, but they're false beliefs that still persist, in a lot of medical students to this day. And you can imagine how if you carry this false belief with you into your clinical practice, you can see how that can influence the decisions you make about patient care, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure you've probably heard about the experience that Serena Williams had when she was giving birth. She very nearly died.
Mhm.
And I don't recall exactly what some of those articles said, but I believe it was a situation where her doctors weren't listening to her. She was saying, I'm not feeling well, something is wrong. And she finally found somebody to listen to her. Um, and I think people listen to her because of who she is, right? She's Serena Williams, one of the most dominant athletes in the world, if not the most dominant athlete in the world. So she has a voice. But what about those women who don't have a voice?
Right.
Who
It,
listens
you
to
know,
them?
it amazed me. I saw a tweet. This must be, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago. A kid in England. I think he was at Cambridge or Oxford. I don't remember, but he made a guide for dermatology
Hmm.
to more easily identify dermatological conditions on black skin.
Hmm.
And I remember looking at my partner. My partner has a master's in African studies, and
Hmm.
she just looked at me and she said, "How does this not already exist?"
Well,
It's
yeah.
almost
I mean,
like,
yeah. I mean,
it's one of those things that you just kinda look and you have a blank stare at each other and you kinda go like, "Did this not already exist?" You know?
I mean, I think about my combat medic training. I've gone through some civilian EMT courses. I've got medical textbooks here at the house, and rarely, very rarely do you run across a picture in any of these books with a person of color. And
Right.
it sort of makes sense, right? That, the way that a condition of the skin would appear in a person of color versus a white person will look different, but we're not trained. We don't use this broad, selection of people to train on. When I was working in Texas Children's Hospital, I was an ER tech, and one of our nurses, bless her heart, she really loved to teach people. She told me then, she said, Daryl, doing an IV on a dark skinned person is going to be very different than doing that IV on a white person. So I'm going to show you a little trick that's going to make it very easy for you. And so she took out her pen light and stuck it on the bottom of this dark skinned patient's hand, who we need to start an IV on, turn the light on. And what that light did, it shone through the bottom of the hand and illuminated, the veins and arteries at the top of the hand,
Hmm.
right? And so just learning little tricks like that, based on that patient's skin color, makes it so much easier to be able to provide care and so forth.
So it sounds like there could be perhaps a revision of medical texts or a revision in medical training for people of color. For little tips and tricks like that would be extra valuable in
Hmm.
medical training.
Hmm.
Uh,
Absolutely. But there's so much that goes into medical training. I think one of the things that we would have to consider is, okay, well, where can we fit this stuff in? So in other
hmm,
words, there's so much in the way of biomedical sciences, right? You take X number of hours of anatomy and so many hours of biochemistry and genetics and all these different things. And I'm sure that if we sat here between the two of us, we could probably think of 50 more things that need to be in medical curricula. But again, where do you find the space? Are you willing to add an extra year or two to medical school, or are you willing to say we need to cut down on the biomedical sciences to add some of these other things? And I don't know what the answer would be, honestly.
yeah, that's an interesting kind of almost counter argument, right? Because not a counter argument, but you're right. I mean, there's so much to teach. There's only so much time.
Mhm,
So that is
mhm,
very interesting. Um, the reason why that I'm especially interested in your research is because I'm just going to read it off from my piece of paper here, but
mhm,
you are specifically researching HIV and PrEP prescribing practices for African Americans in the U.S. And so
mhm.
now I'm curious. Now that I know a little bit more about you, about your wife's dad, is this personal? Is this something that really was inspired by your wife's dad?
He's definitely part of why I'm doing this. Before his death, he wanted to establish a website where he could provide, all sorts of resources and tips and help, to other, gay black males. And he and I were going to work on that website together. And unfortunately, he passed before we had the chance to. But even before I met Derek, I had, several experiences that helped to inform my whole interest in HIV/AIDS work and so forth. So I volunteered one time for a social service organization in Houston that served the needs of LGBT individuals who were HIV positive. And what I actually did when we had individuals who had AIDS and they were in the final stages of their life, I would go to just sit with them, hold their hand, just comfort them or what have you, as they made their transition. And, that made a big impact on me because at that time there were so many people who were being disowned by their families and things like that. And, I just felt like no one should ever die alone. Right.
Mm.
So there was that. And then one of my buddies from the army, um, I knew he was gay from the time that we were in our combat medic training together, but he was a damn good soldier and a really good friend. But his family cut him off, and he eventually contracted HIV, developed AIDS, and because his family cut him off, he couldn't go back home to Guam, where he was from, to spend his final days. So he came to live with me. This was in 1999. So he came to live with me, and he spent the last 6 or 7 months of his life living with me. And so again, I just feel like nobody should ever die alone. And then eventually, my thoughts started to transition to nobody should die from this period, right? And
Mhm.
certainly nobody should be judged because of, sexual orientation, race, religion, whatever the hell, all these isms, that we tend to judge people by. So it's just sort of all these things that came together to influence, my interest in this particular line of research.
Yeah, you have a big heart, don't you?
Yeah, I love people. I love people.
Mhm. Um, what exactly have you found in your studies so far? So it's prescribing practices for African Americans in the U.S. That's the formal way of saying it. What have you learned
Right.
so far? Are there issues with prescribing practices? Are there improvements that should be made?
There's definitely issues. And the neat thing about doing a dissertation is that it gives me the chance to sort of see where the gaps are. And what I am discovering is that PrEP prescribing is really uneven across the nation. So here in the South, we potentially have the greatest or the highest PrEP need, really for all races, but particularly for African Americans. Yet PrEP prescribing is the lowest here. So, but if you compare us to a place like, say, the Northeast, New York City, Philadelphia, those kind of cities, they do a lot better job of prescribing PrEP there. Why
I'm
is
just gonna
that?
Sorry, Daryl. I'm just gonna stop
Mhm.
you for 1 second. Can
Yeah.
we just tell people what PrEP is?
Yeah, yeah. So PrEP stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. There are two medications that are prescribed for PrEP. So Truvada, which was approved in 2012, I believe, and Descovy, which was prescribed in 2019. And so the idea behind PrEP is that if you are going to have unprotected sex, you can take a pill a day, basically, and that cuts down on your risk of contracting HIV. And so the studies that I've seen suggest that Truvada and Descovy can reduce your risk of contracting HIV by up to 99% as long as you take it as directed. There are some side effects attributable to Truvada and Descovy, but they're mild, particularly as compared to the idea that you could contract HIV, right? So one of the issues that we see with Truvada and Descovy is that these can be potentially costly medications. Some of the literature that I've seen suggests that a year's worth of medication for somebody who doesn't have any sort of health insurance could be anywhere between $14,000 to $20,000 for that year. So that is definitely a potential issue that we need to troubleshoot. But what I am really interested in is why is it that primary care providers, particularly here in the South, aren't prescribing? So is it a lack of knowledge on the part of the primary care provider? Is it a issue of stigma on the part of the primary care provider? Is it issues pertaining to the time that it takes to do HIV counseling and testing to patients before you even get to, prescribe, the PrEP or what have you? I know that in general, a lot of physicians don't even like to talk about sexual health with their patients. I'm 48 years old and I've never had a physician to ask me, well, can you tell me about your sexual habits or your sexual history? You know, I've
Mhm.
never had a physician to say, you know, would you like PrEP? When I'm coming into your office, you don't know if I'm married. You don't know if I have multiple sex partners or if I'm having unprotected sex or if I'm an IV drug user or what have you. So you need to be assessing every patient, for their sexual health. But I've never had a physician to do that. And that's something that we see, that's fairly common.
Yeah, and it's definitely fairly common in Canada as well. I
Hmm.
mean, I myself have it's funny because my doctor bless him because he's actually a really sweet man.
Hmm.
But frequently has said, "Oh, because STI testing is important for everyone. It's something that we should all do regularly." And he's like, "Well, but you're a lesbian. Why do you need an STI test?"
See,
you know?
yeah, yeah,
So
right. Well, I mean, that's a perfect case in point. Again, stereotypes and making assumptions about people.
right,
Right.
exactly.
Hmm.
So you are doing this study. When do you think you'll be done your PhD?
Lord willing, 2021, hopefully by May. So my funding runs out in May of 2020.
Ah,
So if I don't want to pay out of pocket, I better be done. And actually, last week I submitted my first three chapters of my dissertation to my committee chair. Uh, those first three chapters comprise the dissertation proposal. She should have some feedback for me by tomorrow. My wife is going to help me to do the edits. I'll send that back to her, and then from there, she'll send it out to the committee. I'll have my proposal defense, submit everything to the IRB, and then hopefully, maybe by mid October to the end of October, I'll be able to start data collection. So I'll be doing a cross sectional study, so designing a survey in Qualtrics and delivering that across social media. Hopefully, I'll be able to maybe piggyback off of some of the virtual conferences, like have a link to my survey on the virtual conference page where providers can go and take the survey. I've got some providers here in Texas who have already agreed to take the survey. So I think, fingers crossed, I think that I should have a reasonably easy time, straightforward time collecting the data.
what
But
kind of stuff are you looking for in that kind of survey?
so, I'm going to be assessing HIV stigma. So I've got a panel of questions that ask about attitudes, towards, IV drug users, LGBT patients, homeless patients, those sort of things. I'll be assessing knowledge. What do they know about PrEP? Have they ever been exposed to any sort of training in PrEP? How comfortable do they feel with assessing a patient's for PrEP needs? Then I think I've got four or five questions where I'm asking sort of their overall HIV/AIDS knowledge as well. And so, what I want to do is see if there are any associations between a provider's personal factors, so things like their age, where they practice at, HIV stigma attitudes, sexual orientation, gender, race, and their professional factors. So things like, are they a physician versus a nurse practitioner versus a PA? What type of primary care provider they are. So that would be like family medicine, internal medicine, OB-GYN. What was the other category I'm looking at? Family, internal, OB-GYN. I think those are the only three I'm looking at. And just see if there's any associations between all those factors and whether or not they're actually going to be prescribing PrEP. And then I also want to know what stage they're at in terms of making a decision to either prescribe or not prescribe. So there's a particular model that we use in public health called the precaution adoption process model, right? It's a stage of change model with seven different stages, and each one of those stages corresponds to where an individual is going to be in their decision to either adopt a particular behavior or not adopt a particular behavior. And this could be important in the context of my study because let's just say if we have a lot of research participants who say, you know what, I'm thinking about prescribing PrEP, but I'm unsure. Well, that will allow us to devise an intervention to target people at that very specific stage to push them over the hump to prescribing, right?
Hmm.
So, but yeah, that's broadly how I've conceptualized my dissertation study, though.
It sounds really fascinating. Like, I can't wait to actually be able to hear what the results show.
Man, I dream about it all the time. It's like all we talk about in my household now. So, yeah.
Did you say earlier that your wife is also an academic?
Yeah, yeah. So she actually works for A.T. Still University School of Osteopathic Medicine in Arizona. She teaches in the DO MPH program, and she's also the director of community-oriented primary care. So she is definitely a public health ally. Done a lot of work in HIV/AIDS, particularly with the LGBT community. Prior to starting at A.T. Still, she was a clinical assistant professor at Arizona State University in the community health program as well. So
So
both of us
essentially,
are jack of all
well,
trades.
yeah, I was gonna say the Traylor household pretty much talks medicine all the time, don't they?
Yeah, yeah, medicine and smoothies and food.
Smoothies? What are you talking
Yeah,
about?
my
They
my
got
wife
the
my
actual.
wife loves making these weird smoothies. So she like it'll be like bananas and strawberries and kale and collard greens or whatever whatever we've got in the
Oh
fridge.
my.
So it's sort of the running joke. I mean, her smoothies are really good, but she never makes the same smoothie twice. And so I've been on her for years to actually write the recipes down because my palate isn't as broad as hers is. So she can make a smoothie with any vegetables and fruits that we have, and I just like a very limited range of things. I just wish that she would write those recipes down so that I could have them
So
more frequently.
now I gotta ask, is there a Daryl smoothie? Is there one that's like the one?
Yeah, so there was one that she made. It was like beets, pineapple, kale, orange, and I think kiwi. And it was just like the right blend of sweetness and tartness for me. I've
Hmm.
had that one twice, and I haven't had it since. I think, in fact, the last time I had it was maybe 2014 or something like that. And I think it's because she probably doesn't remember the recipe and the ratios of all the different fruits and everything.
Hilarious.
Yeah, I love her to
Oh
death, though. I mean,
man.
she is, truly one of a kind. I mean, I honestly would not be here at this point in my education if it wasn't for her. When she and I met, I told her that eventually I wanted to earn a PhD and go to medical school. And she said, well, you know what, as long as you're making progress towards your goal, I'll be right there by your side, helping you to get through. And there were many a night when I was an undergrad when she was editing papers while I was at work, or helping me to fix my APA, because I started undergrad in '05 not as a very good writer, but she taught me, to be a good writer, you know. And now that I'm a PhD student, again, it's just the same sort of thing, editing, papers for me, and helping to keep me motivated, and all these different things. And one of the reasons why she took the job at AT Still, she said, I want to learn about medical school admissions so that I can help you with your path to medical school. And so she's been preparing me for my hopefully upcoming interviews, in a couple of weeks or what have you. And I just can't say enough good things about her.
She sounds like a wonderful partner.
Yeah, she is. She's truly the
Hmm.
best.
And medical school. Let's talk about that for a second here,
Hmm.
because I've seen on Twitter a few posts about about your quest to medical school. What
Hmm.
is it exactly? Why aren't you satisfied with your nursing PhD? Why medical school now?
For starters, I am just going to be a lifelong learner.
Mhm.
I just love learning stuff. And some people would say, well, you can just go pick up a book and just learn stuff. And that's true. And I certainly have tons of books that I'm learning things out of. But medicine in particular, again, another one of those personal stories. So my mother, has been a long time drug addict. And I remember uh, when I was a child, she used to do a lot of doctor shopping, and so sometimes she wake me up at 11:30 or 12 or 1 in the morning or whatever to drive her to a local ER, and sometimes we go to two or three different ERs across the city of Houston before she found a doctor who would give her something. But what I remember was how a lot of the doctors and nurses looked upon her with disdain, right? Instead of stepping back to say, well, what is it that led this person to making these sort of life choices? They would look at her and just, I don't know, maybe make this assumption that, well, you just want to be this way. We're sick of you. In fact, she had a nickname at some of the local ERs in Houston. They used to call her a frequent flyer, you know.
Wow.
And I've seen lots of people treated that way in the course of my career in healthcare. And I hope that I can do something to bring that to a stop, certainly with my patients. I mean, I'm not under any illusion that I can change all of U.S. healthcare, but certainly with the people who I treat, I want to bring my public health background, my compassion, the skill that I'll learn from medical school, into such a way that people can come to me with any problem and feel that I'm treating the person, as opposed to judging them, or making these snap decisions based on something that I see on the outside, if that makes sense.
Of course, it absolutely does. Is your mom okay now?
Unfortunately, no, no. She,
Mm.
the thing about drug addiction, particularly prescription drugs, those are her drugs of choice. Those things are so devilishly hard to beat. And I've heard a lot of people say that, if you have to choose, something to be addicted to, you'd rather that be a hardcore street drug because again, the access to the prescription drugs is so readily available. I mean, I can remember, back in the 80s and early 90s when doctors would prescribe my mother, 90 or 100 Xanax.
Mhm.
No medicine should be that easy to get. But then at the same time, we also don't have effective means to treat people, who have drug addictions, particularly with prescription meds. And then there's not enough access to treatment. You know,
Right.
um, to be 100% honest, it sometimes amazes me that my mother has made it to this point in her life. She's in her 70s now, and I think that the only reason that she's not as bad as she was in the 80s is simply because she doesn't have the money or the access, that she once had, when she and my father were married, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's difficult because things like pain medication, I mean, they do work. They do serve a purpose, right?
Mhm. Yep.
And it's just very difficult. I think with all this life experience that you've had, I think you're going to be such a fantastic physician.
I
Do
pray so.
you do you want to do primary care or do you want to be a specialist?
I want to do primary care. That's where I see the biggest need, and certainly the skills and different experiences that I've had, I think would fit most in primary care.
Mhm.
Again, my background in public health, I've worked in case management and social services, and so I sort of understand that particular niche of medicine. Um, Better than I would say cardiology or something. And then of course, it's interesting because we always talk about how expensive healthcare in the US is. And I'm like, well, if we just keep people from getting sick, then they don't need to go see the cardiologist or the HIV specialist or whatever. If we can intervene early on at the primary care level, maybe we can really do something to drive down the cost of medicine.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, and especially right now with the pandemic, I think people are avoiding their doctor's office. They're
Right,
avoiding the
right,
routine blood check. They're avoiding talking about sex with their doctors because they think, there's something more serious in the air anyway.
right.
Um, so how have you been? It'd be kind of silly not to talk about it. Where it's a pandemic. How are things going?
Man, this has been rough. It's
Mhm.
been rough, so my wife and I love Arizona, but we wanted to move to Texas to be close to my family. Um, and so like literally, I mean like literally 2 weeks after we move, we go on lockdown. And so I have not seen my father physically in the month since, gosh, when was the last time I saw my dad? The fact that I can't remember the last time I saw my dad tells you how
Yeah.
long it's been. I haven't seen my mother. Well, I'll take that back. I did see my mother. Unfortunately, one of my cousins committed suicide shortly after the pandemic began, and so we had a socially distanced funeral memorial service for him in Dallas. And so I got to see my mother, and that's been the only time that I've seen my mother, during this time. And as hard as it is for me, it's even worse for my wife because all of her relatives are in Detroit, and as you have probably heard, Michigan has been one of the hardest hit states. So, we haven't flown to Michigan to see her people again because of the risk. At the same time, I realize that my wife and I are blessed. Both of us are able to continue working when so many people have been laid off and don't have the means to, pay their rent, buy groceries, take care of their children. So that's something that I'm really thankful for. And so I know that at some point in time, this is going to end. But man, it definitely hasn't been an easy year.
Right. Are
Yeah.
you glad that you're back in Texas though?
Um, I have mixed feelings, honestly. I mean, there's things that I have definitely missed about Texas, since I originally left. But I also love Arizona. I moved to Arizona initially in 2004, and then my wife came in 2007, and we established family and friends out there. One of her cousins, young cousin Justin, he lives in Arizona. A lot of we got to be really close friends with a lot of our high school classmates and a lot of our former coworkers at Arizona State University. So like our whole life is there. All the formative stuff that happened in me and Ebony's relationship happened in Arizona. So it's kind of tough, honestly. Um, we also recognize that with me applying to medical school, I could end up anywhere. So, we're prepared for the fact that, we could go back to Arizona, we could stay here in Texas, it could be Virginia, who knows? But at some point in time, I imagine that we'll probably go back to Arizona and permanently throw down roots, whether that's, in the next year or 4 or 5 years from now. I don't know, but I think that'll happen at some point.
Okay. Uh, I did a little bit of research on you.
Mhm.
So I found your Rate My Professor page. Yep, I found it. And you have a very high rating. And I found that really adorable actually because your students appear to have really nice things to say about you. So I was curious, what does it take to be a good teacher?
um, for me personally, part of it is just remembering what it was like when I was sitting on the other side of the desk. Um, I think that a lot of faculty members are not cognizant of the fact that, especially in this day and age, that students have multiple responsibilities that maybe they didn't have in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I mean, I've had students who have three, four, or five children, single parent. I had a student one time who was homeless. He was sleeping in his car over on the ASU campus and couldn't make it to class every day because sometimes he was just so tired and so worn out that class was the last thing that he thought about. There was a period of time when I was an undergrad when I was homeless, and I can remember my organic chemistry professor. She was wonderful, and I remember her saying, like, Daryl, look, the last thing in the world that you need to be thinking about is organic chemistry right now. Go take care of yourself. And so I think it just starts with having that compassion, being able to listen to the students. I think the next thing is trying to adopt strategies that can reach all of the students. I can remember sitting in general chemistry. God, we had what 500 or 600 students. It seemed like, and I don't. In fact, I don't even know if we ever actually got to see our professor. I think it was like a graduate teaching assistant or something like that. And it was just like these PowerPoint slides, and you're flying through 80 or 90 slides in that hour, and maybe you're able to reach some students that way, but other students maybe not so much. And so, I've tried different strategies, over the years to make sure that I'm reaching as broad of a cross section of students, as I possibly can. And then just taking the time to listen to your students. One of the, I've done a lot of online teaching over the years in addition to face to face, but, I've always taken time to listen to those students, so in fact, I've got a student meeting after our podcast is over. He and I are going to jump on Zoom, and he's very interested in understanding how he can use his public health background with the training that he's getting in dental school. And so, we've got an hour set aside, and I'll talk to him about everything I know. And I think that if you just really sort of humanize yourself as a professor, then you'll reach your students, and the outcomes are going to be better. I don't have any scientific background or any scientific data to prove that, but I guess if my ratings on Rate My Professor are good, I guess that's proof in the pudding.
Um, Daryl, if a 17-year-old young man who is a lot like who you were when you were 17 came up to you today and said, "How do I become like you?" What would you tell him?
I would tell them, first of all, don't try to be like me. Be whatever it is that you are meant to be, and understand that the path to discovering that may not necessarily be a straight path, but it can be a very fun path, a very rewarding path, to go through whatever it is you have to go through to figure it out. Um, that being said, I think there are a few things that we all should do to get to wherever it is that we're trying to go. Right? I think that we all need to have some expectation that things aren't going to just be given to us. We're going to have to work for whatever it is that we want. Some of us may have to work a little harder than others, but we all need to be prepared to work. I think that you also have to treat yourself with loving kindness. You're going to have times where you fail at something. You'll have times where you may fail at something multiple times. I took organic chemistry 3 separate times before I passed it, but every time I failed it, I got up, dusted myself off, took it again, right? So you sort of have to have a spirit of, how would I say, I'm not going to quit, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, be very open minded to whatever life is trying to show you. Be open minded to the people who are trying to come into your life. Well, I would say that with reason. Some people aren't meant to be a part of your life. Some people aren't meant to be a part of your life for a long time. Some people are meant to be a part of your life forever. But you just have to sort of be open minded, to those different people and those different situations. I would say, and then certainly if you can find someone who is going to be a good mentor, somebody that will listen to you, that also helps as well. But I would never want to tell somebody to strive to be like me. Be who you are meant to be, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I am I'm now wondering,
Hmm.
have you ever thought about writing a book about your life or, doing a documentary or anything like that?
My wife says that I should. I don't think I'm that damn important, but maybe. I mean, maybe you never know. You never know. Certainly, I mentor a lot of students now, and I'm flattered, by some of their compliments and so forth, and a lot of them have said, well, you've really helped me to change my life in different ways, and maybe you should put all this stuff into a book. So you never know. If I ever get a little free time, maybe that'll be my next project.
You'll be so busy with your patients.
Right.
But listen, I mean, it's been fantastic getting to know you, getting to speak with you. I think you are a beautiful human being.
Well,
It's
thank
really
you.
been an honor, Daryl. So thank you so much for saying yes, first of all, and for, just for being vulnerable enough and sharing with us your passions and your interests and your past.
Well, I thank you for having me on. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.
Likewise.